Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the attendees worldwide, and a warm welcome to our speakers for this Daring Cities 2023 session. My name is Korea Salehi, and I'm the head of Urban Research, Innovation, and Development Department at ICLEI World Secretariat and coordinator of ICLEI's Global Research and Innovation Strategy across ICLEI offices. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this Daring Cities session titled From Incremental to Transformative Change, Leveraging Systemic Management Innovations to Enable Just Transition. ICLEI is championing systemic management innovation with multiple partners worldwide. And today, we have the opportunity to showcase one of the leading approaches having a real impact on the ground in cities. Before we start, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event, since we want to ensure it's an interactive and fruitful discussion today. As you can see, you have been automatically muted. However, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing them into the Q&A box in Zoom. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them towards the end of the session. You can also upvote other participants' questions by clicking on the like button to indicate you're also interested in having that question asked. This function will help us address the most voted questions first. We are also using a new form of interaction today, which I'm super excited about that. You will be led through a guided survey during the session where you will have the opportunity to assess the level to which your organization, enterprise, local government is working systemically. And not only will we perform this assessment in real time, but you will also be able to leave with a concrete outcome to hopefully build upon outside of this session. More information on how to participate in this activity will be shared with you in a few minutes. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be shared on Daring Cities' website. In this way, we can ensure that the insights from this discussion expand beyond the session to interested experts in different time zones or those colleagues and interested parties with conflicting commitments. I've already received feedback from a few partners for asking for the link of the recording, including colleagues from SDG Compact Fellows, UNEP's HESI, and the U.S. Partnership for Sustainability Education, to name but a few. The topic we are discussing today is very timely, and we have brought together four incredible speakers who are experts and leaders in governance and sustainability to guide the session today. It's my pleasure to welcome the following distinguished speakers to this session. Ms. Ting Pan, the Manager of Sustainability, the City of Nanaimo in Canada. Randy Saad, the Executive Director of Refocus and Flourishing Enterprise Institute in Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. Bill Bowie, the Senior Director at Art 3.0. And of course, Mr. Donga Muwowo, the Program Manager of South African Cities Network in South Africa. Before we get into the deep dive of today's session, I would like to take a moment to introduce the topic and the angle from which we are approaching it. From climate change to biodiversity loss, increasing droughts, food insecurity, and pandemics, as a global society, we are living in turbulent times, and governments, both at the national level, subnational, and local level, are tasked with navigating leadership in the midst of this polycrisis, with the most severe effects concentrated in low and middle income countries. As an example, average emissions in some regions of the global south are very close to the budgets compatible with a just 1.5 degree scenario. Yet, the burden of environmental hazards is 35% higher for people living in poverty. A hyper-connected world with complex and dynamic feedback loops across systems such as climate, energy, food, water, waste, and finance, offers new types of vulnerabilities and opportunities. Against this backdrop, there is a renewed interest in planning, governance, and management practices and systems to tackle the dynamic contemporary challenges faced by cities and regions and grasp emerging opportunities. The keywords when you look at the polycrisis are systemic and dynamic. However, many of our existing planning and governance and management approaches have remained static and without developing the capacity to engage with the complexities of a systemic perspective. When we look at historical approaches, We see top-down methods of master planning, which focus on narrow and static goals without needing to accounting for a rapidly changing context. Here in Germany, where I am currently, we have a city called Karlsruhe, which translates to Charles' Peace. Legend has it that the initial plan for this city to be built was based on a dream that a ruler named Charles had while sleeping. This is an extreme example, but still today we are seeing massive capital being directed to building new cities from scratch according to master plans rather than existing cities undergoing significant transformation to enable current citizens to live flourishing lives. I think we all have heard about this type of plans that is really mind-blowing and might not be really in line with sustainability principles in some of the regions, mostly in the regions that the governments, both at the national and local level, have enough capital to invest in this type of experimentations. I think we can all agree that times have changed, but have our governance and planning and management structures and methods changed with the times? There's no doubt fantastic work being done, which we will hear about it in this session. But I think that there is still a huge gap. And the reason for this gap is the complexity of solving. What we need is an approach that takes a long-term perspective, mobilizes all actors in a collaborative effort, and has built-in feedback loops and flexibility to be improved and adapted to changing situations and to different contexts. To develop this approach, we need to work with cities, meeting them where they are, and understanding their citizens' needs in order to plot and facilitate a way forward. Systemic management innovation as a concept is taking a big step in the right direction. This approach is informed by the limitations of existing governance and management systems, which means that they are actively responding to the existing shortcomings. It encourages a shift in the role of governments from service provider to community enabler, meaning that to basically challenge this siloed approach as a conventional approach and foster the development of multi-level governance approaches, both horizontally and vertically, would be facilitated through this approach. And it means that governments, instead of providing the service, will provide an enabling environments and capabilities needed for the other actors to deliver on what is needed at the local level. So it brings about, obviously, new forms of inclusive and sustained citizen engagement, focusing on value co-creation, and brings fresh perspective to reassessing and proposing new ways to set KPIs, key performance indicators, and monitor progress within a local government and within a jurisdiction in relation to contemporary challenges. I hope that this brief introduction to the topic has stimulated your interest. We have a wonderful panel of speakers today that I'm sure will be bringing a mix of theoretical and applied perspective to the table. So let's enter the discussion with a shared motivation to grapple with complexity and be open to new perspectives and ideas. I cannot wait to see where the wealth of knowledge at our disposal leads the session today. On that note, I would like to kick things off by handing the floor to our first speaker, Randy Sad. Randy, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Poria. It's a pleasure to be with you and everyone else. Thanks to those joining, and a special thanks to the equitably events team for putting on the event. Also very excited to be speaking on this topic. I'm typically more of a practically oriented individual, but today my role in this conversation is to speak more on the theoretical and to lay a bit of a foundation for our conversation. So I'd like to pick things up just where Poria left them off. Just a cue from some of the description he offered around the challenge that we see in kind of the local government sector in terms of how we're meeting complexity and the like. I'm reminded of a report I was exposed to at the ICLEI World Congress a couple of years ago, which included this Innovate for Cities report that was published and presented at that event. What stuck out to me is this triple helix model you see on the right here, which kind of speaks to, through a deep analysis of the state of climate action planning across the local government sector, what some of the barriers and challenges are, and some of the key elements that were mentioned were the idea that, you know, we really need a change in mindsets and new tools and processes in order to steward the kind of transformational change that's necessary. And I highlight a couple of the elements here, you know, visioning for the future, an integrated systems approach, people-centered solutions. What was really kind of shocking and a bit inspiring to me was how well aligned the visual is with our theory of change, our models, and the work that we've been doing, which I'll now speak to. Apologies there. I think my screen wasn't displaying correctly for a moment, but I think it should be okay now, hopefully. Please let me know in case that's not the case.
Yes, we can see your screen. Thank you, Ren.
Wonderful. So in terms of the perspective that I'm speaking to, I think it's fair to acknowledge that, you know, there's an incredible amount of work and exceptional individuals who are working in sustainability, climate, equity, diversity, inclusion offices within the public sector and within local governments in particular. I think the question that we tend to gravitate towards is, you know, why aren't we making more progress? Why are we stuck in incrementalism, far from the goals that we know we need to meet? And so I'd like to engage in this question, this line of thinking with a bit of our worldview and how we're approaching the challenge perhaps a little bit differently than many. So our view, per Porya's perspective that he just shared, is that we see an evolving purpose of local government, you know, coming from a history where local governments perhaps were a little more simple and straightforward in nature, where the design of the organization was mostly developed around managing for the optimization of service delivery. And as we've seen, you know, the complexity of the challenges emerging, the poly-crisis, the accelerating change that municipalities, that local governments are forced to react to, we see an evolving purpose of government. And, you know, this is bringing us towards this new era where local governments are really holding a different space. And it's really about enabling the well-being of communities and empowering communities to create a better future. Unfortunately, though, what we see is a mismatch between the practices, the methods, the tools, the capabilities of government to fulfill on this new purpose. And so our view is that we need to transform strategic management practices, that being the practices that are at the center of the organization, at the core of the organization, that fundamentally underpin how planning is done, how decisions are made, how the organization is stewarded forward. So what exactly do we mean by strategic management? I think it's important to make sense of some of these words that I'm using, especially in case they may not be as familiar. So when we talk about strategic management, we're talking about a set of decisions and actions that shape the future of a whole organization with the goals of the organization in mind. So it's really management at the highest or most strategic level of the organization, as simple as that may sound. And so in order to enable a transition towards better strategic management practices, our view is that we need systemic approaches. As Porya was mentioning, this idea of a systemic approach, which was also represented in the triple helix model, is very much necessary to engage with the complexity that is emerging. And so I want to share a little bit about my own background. I've grown up in a global community of practice that I and my colleagues helped to develop that is made up of practitioners, academics, innovators, entrepreneurs, and the like, all of whom have held for the past decade and longer an interest in integrating ideas of the concept of systems theory into how we understand and practice organizational management. And not so much in a pie in the sky sort of idealistic way, but in a really pragmatic and practical way that is underpinned by the idea that if we really understand an organization as a system and within wider systems, we have a much better opportunity to really understand and make sense of the complexity and respond to it effectively. And so what's emerged in this community of practice, and really what the focus of my organization, the Flourishing Enterprise Evolution, the Flourishing Enterprise Institute is, it's around the development and mobilization of what we describe as systemic management innovations. And just to be a little more clear, what I've defined here is just a few points on what makes a systemic management innovation unique from other management knowledge methods and tools. So firstly, as I mentioned, they apply systems theory in order to recast how strategic management is understood and or practiced. Often it's both. Secondly, a systemic management innovation does not conflict with science or that ethics-based planetary boundaries and social foundations. So what I mean by this is often with conventional management, there isn't consideration given to natural systems, to necessary social norms or minimum requirements that need to be met in order for sustainability to be achieved. And so because those elements aren't explicit and part of how we see and think about the management of the organization, whether that's in relation to the organization's health or the health of the systems around it, they tend to lead to decisions being made, plans being developed that really conflict with the realities of our world, the limitations of our world, and what we would describe as thresholds. And finally, systemic management innovations contribute to the development of what we describe as more integrative, collective, and adaptive management practices. So I'd like to delve a little further into these ideas of more integrative, collective, and adaptive practices. Poria mentioned that we would be doing a little bit of an assessment with you that will allow you the opportunity to explore the degree to which your management practices, your organization's management practices are systemic, as a bit of a foundation for us to engage in a deeper conversation as we get into examples and talking about specific innovations that apply in practice. So I'd like to stop sharing my screen now and invite my colleagues to bring up the self-assessment that everyone will be completing if you so choose. I will talk through that self-assessment, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there should be a link to the self-assessment in the chat available so that you can all bring up your own version of this and begin completing the details individually. I want to start with a caveat. I mean, in general, the idea of systemic strategic management practices is quite complex in and of itself, and delving into the depths of what that means. I mean, when we're talking about systemic practices versus conventional ideas and practices associated with management, it's not some sort of minor or incremental change to the outlook, the way that they're defined, designed, and utilized. We're talking about quite a paradigm shifting way of thinking and understanding organizational management. So this self-assessment, while rather superficial, is just kind of a starting point for our conversation to make things a little more practical and personal, applicable, hopefully, as we will get into examples, as I mentioned. I hope that you can appreciate, this is just a quick and very high-level run-through that we hope to carry you along on. And it should offer some value, though it's not by any means scientific, thorough, rigorous, etc. So please do insert the first point there on which organization you represent, and click next to go to the following page, where we'll begin talking through the aspects of systemic management. I guess to begin, our version of strategic management breaks down to three key areas. They include planning, performance management, and relationships. And so we'll be looking at how planning, performance management, and relationships are more integrative, collective, and adaptive when a systemic approach is applied. And really what I'm going to be asking each of you to do is to consider what integrative, collective, and adaptive planning looks like, for example, and to rate your organization's current practices from being 1, minimally systemic, to being 5, highly systemic. And again, there's no prizes for getting top scores, so please do your best to just be honest and really vulnerable about what you share. This isn't being tied back to your organization or anything like that. It's really for your own benefit. So without further ado, let me, I should mention, apologies, that all of the information is being anonymously aggregated into an overall view. So at the conclusion of this exercise, we can take a look and see where the group has positioned themselves as a collective, and just have a little bit of a chat about what that says and what we might be able to draw as insights from those results. So again, if we can go back to the prior page on planning, we'll begin there. So by planning, I mean, no showstoppers. We basically just mean the idea of setting objectives and determining the best course of action for achieving those objectives as an organization. So planning can be strategic, it could be master planning, it could be community planning. Any number of planning functions exist within local governments. So I want you to think about all of those planning functions or processes as a group. So integrated planning, from our perspective, is generally aligned with an ambitious and concretely defined vision and purpose. That vision and purpose would be science aligned and specific in our world, but we won't get into the details of that for now. And also that planning to be integrated would be based on interconnections between issues, opportunities, and departments. That to say, plans are not independent of one another or created in silos. They're considerate of all of those potential interconnections across the organization, as well as outside of the organization. So by collective, what we mean is that the planning that occurs is considerate of the needs, priorities, and plans of all external stakeholders, that being any organization, individual, or otherwise who exists within the community local government is responsible for. And ultimately, it's developed with them. So often is the case, plans are developed with some consultation, input from a representation of some portion of those stakeholders, but certainly not all. In the case of a truly collective plan, all of the stakeholders who have an interest in those plans would be engaged meaningfully. Further, planning would be adaptive. And what we mean by adaptive is that the nature of what is defined is based on and responsive to sustainability performance, as in how the community and the organization are actually performing against all of our goals, not just service delivery, not just financial goals, but based on environmental, social, and economic goals more broadly. And also the practices used result in using foresight-informed practices that give us insight into the far future, as well as what we're navigating more immediately, and are considerate of changing conditions. So essentially, the planning is responsive to what is emergent and adaptable. Hopefully, everybody's had a moment to consider those details, and without being too rigorous or intensely focused on the details, just come up with a number that you feel is representative, and we'll move on to the next. Now we're looking at performance management, and by performance management, we're talking about essentially the organization's functions that are focused on identifying, measuring, analyzing, and interpreting relevant data to support the pursuit of goals and decision making. So in terms of performance management being integrated, we would see it being necessary that the nature of performance management conducted is thresholds-based and science and ethics informed. So this to say that we're understanding fully of the systems that the organization and the community are nested within. We understand the boundaries or the thresholds of those systems, whether that requires the supply of a social good or a constraint that is ecologically oriented, and that the organization is aware of its fair share or its responsibility to maintain those thresholds, given that most of them are shared by a larger or wider population or set of actors who are dependent on either environmental resources or social goods that need to be provided by different actors. Finally, integrative also means that there's agreement in practices across departments and at scales of measurement, from the lowest level of the organization all the way up to strategy and vision, and even thinking more broadly at the community scale and potentially at levels like regions or nations, where there's a clear through line between how performance is understood within wider contexts and lower level contexts, like a team or a division within the organization. By collective, we mean considerate of duties and obligations owed to stakeholders. This just to say the organization has impacts that affect different stakeholders positively and negatively, and approaches to performance management should be fully considerate of those impacts. And similar to planning, the practices and the ideas of how performance is measured, how responsibility is assigned, et cetera, should be defined or developed with those external stakeholders directly. And finally, performance management is adaptive based on beginning with an assessment of materiality. And by materiality, what we mean is what's important, what's most important to sustainability, having an objective and methodical approach to determining what's most important. And ultimately, that indicators, thresholds, targets, et cetera, that are defined are adjusted as conditions change. Our view is that performance management should be context-based, as in what is most important for a local government to measure in one place is not necessarily going to be the same as it would be in another. And it's most important that not only we define what's contextually relevant, but as conditions in the local environment change, what gets measured and how resources are allocated to performance management activities are adjusted in response to how what matters to measure changes. And we can go on to our last element of strategic management, relationships. So by relationships, we basically mean the development and maintenance of relationships that the local government holds with all stakeholders. So integrative relationships, by that we mean stakeholders are essentially consistently and meaningfully engaged regardless of the department and need. And so to make that a little more clear, I think often the symptom or the nature of engagement that we see is depending on the need that arises. A certain group or approach will be taken to engaging with the public or other actors that are very much specific to that particular need and not within the context of the broader relationship and the history of engagement, the past relationship that has existed, and the needs and interests of those individuals. So collective in this context means that engagement is transparent, open, inclusive, equitable, and ultimately contributes to trust building. And ultimately, it also means that a focus is placed on leveraging deliberative engagement practices. By that, we mean sharing power and recognizing the need that all stakeholders need to contribute to and support the pursuit of the highest level goals of the organization. And so having them directly and deeply involved through our relationships is very important. And finally, we have the adaptive quality. And within the context of relationships, what we mean is that engagement is tailored to each situation. Objectives, needs, stakeholders, timelines, complexity, all of these factors affect what makes sense, and that ultimately we want to draw from a wide range of deliberative practices. Finally, engagement is also initiated in response to stakeholder interests and needs and challenges, not only when the local government has a need for engagement. So the relationship itself matters more than just a process or a specific opportunity that warrants getting input from individuals, either by necessity or because there's an obligation to do so. That covers the exercise. I appreciate it's a little rough and quick, but hopefully you were able to work through it. At the conclusion here, we've given you an opportunity to provide your name and email address, and the team is happy to share the results of your submission and the overall results. In case you're interested in receiving those after the session, feel free to pass along that information so that we can be in touch.
Awesome. Thank you, Randy, for guiding that process. And thanks everyone who filled out the survey. We have obviously the opportunity now to go through the results together and gain some new insights into how prevalent systemic management practices currently are. For local governments in particular, this is a very valuable insight. Assessing performance from a strategic management perspective to find areas of strengths and weakness is a step from abstractly speaking about changing governance approaches to actually identifying where transformation can take place. So just as a very brief comment on the results, we can see that this form has been submitted from multiple different sectors. And I would like to give the floor back to Randy to speak a little bit into this real-time assessment of the results, and we can take it from there. Thank you, Randy. Over to yourself.
I am feeling a bit like a deer in the headlights here. I'm not positive how to interpret the spider diagram based on how all of the details line up. I'm wondering if I could tap on David to share some insights based on what he sees, or to perhaps look toward one of the other views that we have of the compiled data. Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, thanks, Randy, for that. Let me just start my video.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks to everyone for filling out this form. I think that this is very much an experimental exercise that we wanted to try out as kind of like real-time assessment, specifically related to the information that we're relaying through the session on the theoretical side. And now we're kind of linking theory and practice together. So I think what's interesting from this is I was deliberately filling out in my example kind of the maximum values, so that we have that frame of reference. So the outer circle is the maximum percentage of being highly systemic according to the survey. And what we can see is that the majority of results from this outcome show that people have a fairly conservative outlook in terms of how systemically they're currently working. So I think we see some outliers. One of them is my response. Another one is perhaps, according to the legend, the R3.0 NGO, which has maximum or close to maximum values. But I think what we can see from this on the whole is that the majority of participants are really kind of clustered around the 50% mark. And that is also fairly evenly distributed across the three different areas that Randy was outlining. So I think that's also a point that's interesting to take from this, is that perhaps there's not necessarily a specific area that's performing in a worse way than others, but rather there's room for growth towards more systemic activities across all of these different areas. And what we mean by the individual outcomes from this exercise, so we can see if we select one of the profiles here, so for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's go for management consultancy, then we can also see the framework in practice. So these were the scores that were essentially assigned, so showing a low score across the board for a management consultancy. Or sorry, this was actually the University of San Juan. And so this is interesting to see. And these were what we were referring to. If you would like a copy of this, you're welcome to share your email address with us. And we're happy to send it through so that you can use it as a reference moving forward. Thanks again to everyone for participating, and happy to hand the floor back to Randy now to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, David. I will reshare my screen. I think David, your screen needs to be shut down before I can share mine. Any chance we could get the screen share interrupted? Okay, well, in any case, I'll begin speaking until we're able to sort that out. I want to speak a little bit to now our theory of change. So we've discussed systemic practices, systemic strategic management practices, and shared a little bit about what might characterize them. Now, the challenge is we have existing organizations with staff and leaders who have an existing understanding of the world, existing mindsets, existing tools and methods that they rely on, that they've used and leveraged to achieve their success. And so the challenge becomes, how do we lead this kind of disruptive change and steward this new paradigm of management knowledge and practice? So we've often started with this iceberg model, which you might be familiar with. It's typically used, are commonly used in explaining systems theory in various contexts. In any case, the idea behind it is that, the lower the leverage point on the iceberg, the lower down you go, the more transformative the changes, but also the more difficult it is to make. And so we've characterized this particular version of the iceberg around kind of enabling better climate action planning and practices, making more progress. And I think when we see or take an objective look at the nature of how climate action planning happens within most local governments, typically we see the activities happening at lower levels of planning, not at the strategic level per se. That's not to say they're not mentioned or recognized at a strategic level, but the actual planning practices happen at a lower level. And a lot of the projects or initiatives become the focus, which look like the climate actions that are taken by organizations that sit at the top of the iceberg. Our view is that if we want to make this transformative change, we need to begin with the mindsets of leaders. We need to begin to make clear and draw out the assumptions, the flawed assumptions that exist in how we currently make sense of the world and manage our organizations. Based on a new understanding of the world, we need to then engage in the process of transforming strategic management practices. And in our world, our view is that we use systemic management innovations in order to do that. And as a result of this sort of shift in paradigm thinking, understanding, we will see accelerated change in the kind of necessary progress at the higher levels of policy development, planning, and action taking or execution, where change today has remained incremental. And so we see this process as an iterative one. This is not the kind of thing where in one fell swoop mindsets are completely transformed, practices transition overnight, and we end up with the ideal way of functioning by the end. But we do see going from this stage one shifting mindsets to adapting strategic management practices and operationalizing change as an iterative ongoing process that needs to happen. And to support that, I'll just briefly mention we've developed a program called Enterprise Evolution. So our view is systemic management innovations are great, but having innovations in hand doesn't transform an organization. And so Enterprise Evolution is a dialogic and programmatic intervention that we have designed to engage meaningfully and deeply with senior leaders of organizations, including local governments. The conversation related is designed to help leaders come to their own self-recognition of the risk associated with continuing to leverage conventional practice in the face of increasing complexity and accelerating change. And through that process, we begin to identify opportunities for experimenting with, testing, piloting systemic management innovations in constrained or bounded ways. And we do that with organizations hand in hand for two reasons. One, so as to ensure that they're successful in how they apply those innovations in practice. And two, so that through the process of application in a pilot or an experiment, organizational leaders have the opportunity to build the capabilities they will need to not only envision how these innovations can be used at scale, but also to do the work to use them independent of external support. I think I will pause there on the topic of enterprise evolution, which we can come back to, and share just a brief example leading into the examples to come. We've spent the last 2 years. It was our first experiment in the municipal sector, in the local government sector, working with the city of Kitchener, which is a medium-sized city in the eastern part of Canada, a very innovative city. They were going through a strategic planning process that usually spans about 2 years. It's very consultatively oriented and iterative in nature. We essentially designed an enterprise evolution program to support experimenting with various systemic management innovations through their strategic planning process. So the strategic planning process became a canvas for learning and testing systemic management innovations with an interest in more broadly applying those. What I want to mention is that we're going to share a whole bunch of additional information in case you'd like to learn more about enterprise evolution, in case you'd like to learn about the City of Kitchener example, see various deliverables, et cetera, at the conclusion of this session. So there'll be a number of links provided. And the good news is we'll get to go into more specifics and details through our engagement with City of Nanaimo and my colleague Ting, as well as through the commentary and experiences that my colleague Bill Bally will be sharing. So on that note, I'd like to pass things back to Poria and say a big thank you for the time to present.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Randy, for this very insightful presentation, but also a very interesting and thought-provoking exercise. I think this is really helpful to really try to grapple with these concepts in real world and understand how and what this type of concepts mean when it comes to application within the context of enterprises, organization. Just for the audience to know, as Randy mentioned, enterprises, the wide definition, local governments from one perspective are considered enterprises in this context. So and as Randy mentioned, I'm very excited to explore the applied examples of this approach later in the session, and so glad that we have colleagues from the City of Nanaimo. But this is actually a perfect time to segue to Bill, our next esteemed panelist. And Bill, thanks again for joining us today. I would like to take this moment to move across to you for your input and ask you to provide us an introduction to the UNRISD SDPIs and multi-capital scorecard. don't freak out. Bill will unpack what this abbreviation stands for. But this is definitely a crucial step forward in helping organizations measure, manage, and report their performances in terms of their impacts on different types of vital capitals, such as natural, social, and economic capitals. So on that note, I'm looking forward to you shedding light on these approaches and the role that you see them having in enabling systemic management innovation in cities. Bill, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Poria, and thanks to the other panelists in the audience. I want to start out this by scoping back to some historical context, if you will. Just a few slides on that, starting with this quote, which we often start with from Donella Meadows, a lead author of the Limits to Growth report from 1972 that I'll get to in a moment. And what she says is that sustainability, if you're looking to measure sustainability, it should be related to carrying capacity or threshold of danger. So if you're just measuring the tons of nutrient, the phosphorus and nitrogen that's released into a waterway per year, that doesn't mean anything to people. Is it a lot? Is it a little? Is it sustainable? Is it unsustainable? Who knows? So what she says is it's the amount released relative to the amount the waterways can absorb without becoming toxic or clogged begins to carry a message. And I think that she's sort of soft shoeing it there. It actually does carry the key message. So let's look at how this comes out of her work with the 1972 Limits to Growth, which really first introduced the notion of carrying capacity to a broad audience, where it's pretty simple. Like your population has to exist within the resource base that you have at hand. So that's your carrying capacity. Sorry about that. What they saw is that we can also exceed our carrying capacity, which leads to a collapse. This is called overshoot and collapse. And what their research showed, their projection in 1972, which is the dark red line there, is that we would be entering this phase of a collapse increasingly over the last 50 years. And you can see where we are right now, which is right at the inflection point where collapse really starts to hit us hard. This isn't just a conceptual idea. As you can see, this work from the Global Footprint Network, measuring our ecological footprint or our biocapacity, our biological carrying capacity, notes that in 1971, we exceeded our carrying capacity as humanity, and we have been ever since. So we've been operating on what William Catton calls phantom carrying capacity, through shifting from one place to another, from relying on technology that actually is just kicking us the can down the road. So as you can see, we are in overshoot, and we have been for the last 50 years. And even these projections, as you see, go from, overshoot if we continue with business as usual, to still being an overshoot. So even if we reduce carbon emissions 30% by 2030, we're still significantly in overshoot. Now, just for further, the final validation is the planetary boundaries. Since their introduction in 2009, these are 9 boundaries in our ecological systems that we cannot afford to transgress. We're actually, we were transgressing 3 of them when this first came out in 2009. We're now transgressing 6 of them, and apparently 2 more we're transgressing, but the peer review process is still ongoing. Now, on the right-hand side, we see the donut, which many people are familiar with, which added to these ecological ceilings the inner layer of social foundations. And in a 2017 study, Kate Rayworth found that we are undershooting on all 12 of these social foundations. So we are in overshoot and undershoot, and have been for a long time. So essentially, we are in a prolonged state of collapse. So what do we do about this? This is where I get into sustainability context. This is a principle that was introduced by the Global Reporting Initiative in 2002, which said that in order to assess organizational performance or subsystem performance, you have to do it in the context of environmental, economic, and social capital formation and depletion at the local, regional, or global level. So if we're simply reporting on trends in individual performance, that leaves open the question of the organization's contribution to the total amount of these different capitals. So really, we have to contextualize. That's the heart of sustainability reporting, sustainability assessment. So the key line is reporting organizations should consider individual performance in the context of the limits and demands, these thresholds and carrying capacities placed on economic, environmental, social resources at the macro level. How do we do this? So Mark McElroy, a close colleague of ours in 2008, set out in his doctoral dissertation the sustainability quotient, which says that your sustainability is the comparison of your actual impacts on the carrying capacities of vital capital resources, or the numerator, over the normative impact. What would that impact need to be for your organization's proportional impact in order to be sustainable? So that's a little bit of mumbo jumbo. I'm going to give some practical examples here. I'm going to go quickly through 3 examples. So on carbon or greenhouse gases, a carbon footprint is just an individual organization or a region or a nation. It's their carbon emissions. This means nothing to people. The numerator alone, to use Dana's words, means nothing to people unless you contextualize it with their fair share of the carbon budget. Carbon budget is how much we can afford to emit. And so that's one example of contextualization. This next example is actually one of my favorites, and this shows for water use. So the blue bars are the amount of available water on a watershed basis. So as you can see, the maroon bars are an organization's decreasing use of water. Great, right? They're reducing their use of water. But as you can see on the left-hand side, they're still operating unsustainably. They're using more than their fair share of water in that watershed. And if all organizations were doing that, we would run out of water. It would be day zero, like almost happened in Johannesburg. Now, what happens in a drought situation where actually the available water is reducing on a year-by-year basis? Now, organizations can be reducing their water use. In fact, they could be reducing it fairly aggressively, but still be increasing in their unsustainability because the operating context is worsening. And so they would have to actually radically shift their water reduction. Finally, on the social side, here in the United States, we've got a thing called a minimum wage, which would be the equivalent of the baseline that you see here on the left. Now, what we need is a real living wage, which is the threshold over on the right. Anything to the left of a real living wage is patently unsustainable. It is only when we get over to the right, when we cross the threshold identified by the Living Wage Foundation, that we get into a sustainable situation. Now, with some of those specific examples, I want to go to a practical tool set that was developed by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development over the last 8 years. UNRIS, we at R3.0 worked with them throughout that development process. And this is what sort of spurred their work, is that they were looking at the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, right? So there's 231 unique indicators of the progress towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you look at them, only 3 of them have a sustainability threshold built into them. The rest of them are all incrementalist, to use Randy's term, or means nothing to people without that contextualization. And so this is what spurred the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development to go on this 4-year journey of developing the Sustainable Development Performance Indicators. And the first thing was this 2019 paper that I wrote, laying out a 3-tiered typology. Tier 1 is incrementalist numeration. So that's just what means nothing to people. It's just it's the raw data, if you will. It's important, but it doesn't really tell us the story. It's only when we get to tier 2 that we have contextualized denomination. We're adding the denominator to the numerator, so that we're looking at the impacts, the actual impacts, compared to or contextualized against the normative impacts. That takes into account sustainability thresholds in ecological, social, and economic systems, as well as allocating those thresholds to the organizational or municipal or bioregional level. Tier 3, we ended up collapsing into tier 2 in the end, and that was recognizing that transformation from the status quo, or from essentially the culture of overshoot and collapse that we've been living in for a half century, clearly needs to transform. So what resulted was in late last year, UNRISD released the Authentic Sustainability Assessment. This was the manual for implementing the SDPIs. The year before, or earlier that year, excuse me, we released the result of the piloting of those. And I'm just drawing your attention, a number of these organizations, large companies, small cooperatives, even the World Bank, the World Benchmarking Alliance, and others did. But importantly, there was a municipality in there. The city of Kitchener that Randy mentioned was part of that piloting process. And so these are implementable at the municipality level. So I want to go to an even more robust implementation. So this work was predicated on sort of parallel work of developing the multi-capital scorecard, again by Mark McElroy, our colleague, and you'll hear more about that. But first, just to scope back, the sustainability context principle mentioned these multiple capitals. Here they are. Natural capital is what we all exist within. And then nested within that is our social capital, the value of networks, or human capital, the value of individual contributions. And then within that, we have manufactured capital, physical infrastructure, if you will, and financial capital, money, and economic resources. So what the multi-capital scorecard does is it applies, as you see on the right, this sustainability performance assessment across all of those capitals. And what you want to do is hit OPZ 1.0. You want to be where your numerator is either equal to or higher than your numerator, depending on whether you're looking at social or environmental performance. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a performance progression score. So you get scored as you go along, and the far right is just that threshold of sustainability. So all of this progression scoring is within the unsustainable realm that most of us are existing in right now. So really, the key is to progress towards sustainability on a sufficient rate of transformation. Final slide here, because I know Ting is going to go into this in a little bit more depth. I just wanted to introduce the structure of the multi-capital scorecard. It lists on the top all of these capitals that are covered. So including in the financial capital and the economic capitals, if you will, 4 subcategories there. And then it takes a triple bottom line approach of social, economic, and environmental. And then it applies these progression performance scoring. It allows for weighting. And then it aggregates it all into a full score, both for each individual bottom line and a grand total, if you will. So here, 61, this is just a sample implementation. 61, to be clear, is still unsustainable. So I'm going to leave it at that in order to send things across to Ting, who is going to give us some very hands-on examples of implementation within a municipality context. Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill, for your valuable contribution. I particularly enjoyed seeing the water usage example. It's a really powerful example of why context is important when reviewing data. And as you mentioned, storytelling is crucial, and for accurate storytelling, we need to see the full picture, obviously. I also really enjoyed the nested framing of the different forms of capital. I think that this is a more systemic way to view the values that we place on different capitals and how we impact them. It'd be great to see holistic assessments such as this being used more widely by local governments to get the system's perspective in sustainable development going forward. And that brings us, and I see, to the next intervention by Ting Pan from the city of Nanaimo. Thank you so much, Ting, for joining us today. As we move from the theoretical side of this towards more practical aspect, this is a perfect time to yield the floor to you to share the city of Nanaimo's experience of participating in the Enterprise Evolution Program and adopting the donut economics model. It's fantastic to the city of Nanaimo taking such a proactive approach and customizing this model to fit with the unique environment, social, cultural, economic, and political context of the city. So thank you again for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay, and I will try to share my screen. Please let me know if it is working.
It certainly does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you, Randy and Bill, also to set it up so well for me to speak about Nanaimo's experience applying the donut economic framework. So Nanaimo's located on Vancouver Island on the west coast of British Columbia. And I just want to provide a bit of contextual background, how Nanaimo came to, adopt the donut economic model. And so really, I think it was championed by a number of our counselors back in 2019, and they were inspired by Amsterdam's example and came across the donut economic framework at the time when they felt that there is a real lack of vision and a unifying purpose and a coherence, despite that, cities doing many really interesting projects, and it really doesn't feel like, all of the strategic documents and plans that we have has kind of a vision, and it's not really coordinated or integrated, and there are many competing priorities. And our council realized that without that clear understanding and what we're trying to achieve, there is no real way of assessing how we're doing and how we should improve. So the donut offers that really clear and easy to understand vision and very useful framework for us to pull everything together. And this, so it led to this decision towards the end of 2020 that council decided to adopt the donut economic model as a guiding principle for all city initiatives and planning. And so that was also around the time that the city is undertaking a major project, which is to create and renew an official community plan. And that is kind of the overall overarching vision and plan to guide the city's development for the next 15 years. So, the opportunity kind of opened up to integrate the donut economic model in the city plan process. And so July last year, the city plan was adopted and finalized, and this is what is in our city plan. So we have created a Nanaimo donut framework based on that model, but localized in our region. So what it means is that, now we have these 5 major city goals that corresponds to the idea of the donut. So we have the ecological ceilings, and that is represented in the green Nanaimo. And then we have these 4 areas of social foundations that we're looking at. So that means, equitable access and mobility, community well-being, livability, reconciliation, representation, inclusion, and also thriving and resilient economy. And Since then, we also have completed the integrated action plan that was adopted earlier this year. So now we are at the point that we have this kind of city plan that set out high-level policies, overarching kind of visions, and then we have integrated action plans that sets out, what are we going to do over the next 5 years and 10 years, some of the immediate and long-term actions. And then what I have been leading is the monitoring strategy. So what the monitoring strategy is intended to do is to really connect all these dots and provide meaningful and holistic insights and tell us if our actions are effective. So basically using that to figure out what are in the action plan are, whether it's doing its job, is actually helping us track the progress towards the city goals that we set in the city plan. So part of that is to figure out, what indicators we're gonna use to measure our progress and set those targets. And the key indicators, are supposed to tell us how we're doing and show how well a system is working over a period of time, which are, universally used. But I think the difference here is that we're really trying to apply a critical lens and figure out what are the indicators that can closely monitor eventually, what we ultimately want to achieve. And so the targets, it was really kind of, figuring out how can we quantify and those visions and kind of long-term goals. So we started with a pretty long list of draft indicators and targets that we developed during the city planning process. And then I came in to looking for a way to evaluate those draft indicators. And so I ended up partnering up with Randy and Mark McElroy and got introduced to this tool, multi-capital scorecard, and we're applying this to kind of evaluation of our indicators, and that helps us connect these to those intentions that we have for the monitoring strategy. So as you have heard, that multi-capital scorecard is a methodology that helps an organization to move beyond incremental progress and to help develop context-based sustainability performance indicators. And for us, that means, those have to make sense for our corporation, for our city, and for our community. And ultimately, this is to connect actions with goals in a meaningful and integrated way. So I will just walk you through kind of the process of how we applied it and give you some examples. So the first step that we applied is applying these selection criteria when we're looking at any indicators that we're contemplating of using for monitoring. So the first question we ask is is this a significant or relevant issue to our community that we have tools to deal with? As many of you are aware that there is a lot of overlapping and distinct jurisdictions of different level of governments. And for local government, we are more concerned about the issues that we have tools to deal with. And it might be, significant and relevant issue to our community, but it might be, in that the jurisdiction is actually not with us. So when we're looking at our, all the draft indicators, one of the things that when we're looking at it through this lens, we realize that air quality is one issue that we actually don't have tools to deal with. And it's also very localized, and the source of that issue is often outside of the city boundary. So that really helps us kind of, figuring out what are the things that we should really focus on. The second question is there a science or ethics-based sustainability end goal that we can actually articulate in that area of impact relating to that core value of the Nanaimo Donut framework? And which means that it has to be something that we think that the community can agree, or the science community can agree that there is we can articulate what that end goal and what we ultimately want to achieve. So we went through a bit of this process and looking at all the draft indicators and applying these two lenses and basically sorting all these indicators into two piles. One are primary indicators that we can say that, there is a sustainability angle connected to those indicators. And then there are also supportive indicators that don't necessarily connect to that angle or threshold, but they might be still useful for us to monitor our progress in a certain period of time. And one example will be, building permits. So we track things like, how many building permits that we issued each year. And it is a incremental indicator because you can't really say that, there is a certain number of building permits that we need to achieve in order to, get to a state of sustainability, but that still give us some insight as to what's happening in the city in terms of economic activities. But there is a real clear distinction between, what these indicators do by going through this kind of a process. So the next step is assessing the indicators. So we took a critical look at, each indicator and asking if this indicator is a measure of sustainability performance, not just an incremental one. And also, if we can be confident it's a measure of sustainability performance, then what is that threshold of quantity? Can we quantify it? What is the quantity of that resource or capitals involved that must be maintained in order to ensure the well-being of our community? So here are some examples, and this one is really fairly easy to understand now related to climate change, and it's widely used. And there's methodology developed to look at community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, and that is the actual impact that our community have. And then the sustainability threshold, there is a agreement and consensus that we should really get to net zero emissions before 2050. So that is a really solid one. And the next example, we look at water infrastructure. And originally, and I really like Bill's example earlier because, that's our starting point. We're looking at a water resource. And through the conversation engagement with our water department and engineering team, one thing that it come to light is that, we live in a temperate rainforest. So if we're looking at the overall water, resource available to us in our boundary over a year, there isn't necessarily a shortage of water, to meet our need, but it's more of the capacity that we have in terms of our infrastructure that can hold that water to utilize that. So when we first started this project, and like many communities, we're looking at water consumption by residents, usually in terms of the volume of water we consume per capita, and that is a purely incremental indicator. And how do we connect to this fact? Like, how do we know if we're consuming as a community the amount of water that can be sustained by our the resource available to us? And as I mentioned earlier, that is more of a constraint by our infrastructure. And it turns out that our engineering department has a very clear and kind of long proven model to say that, the watershed reservoir has this capacity. And if you don't exceed this capacity, which meant that, if you can maintain at least 30% of that capacity at all times, that could ensure that we get over that drought period. And if we, the reservoir level falls below, then that is a real serious concern. There's still many things that we can do, but it could lead to, like a serious consequence, like shutting down businesses if we have prolonged drought. So through this kind of process and looking at how we can define what it means to the city and to our community, what that sustainability threshold is, we're able to work out a threshold that we can use to measure our performance. The last example I want to give is a social one, is around housing affordability. And so originally we were looking at the average rent of a 2-bedroom apartment as an indicator, and because that information is available and it's annually updated, and again, this could be a very useful indicator, but it's incremental because you can't really say there is a certain dollar amount that we're looking for, and if we hit that level of, rent, then, then housing is affordable. So we literally kind of went back to the definition of a housing affordability, which is, people shouldn't be spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So we look at, the percentage of people, the proportion of population that actually can do that. And the sustainability threshold that we identified is that, really no resident in our community should have to spend more than 30% of their household income. Otherwise, they will be suffering in other areas and it will be really difficult to thrive. The last step is metric development, and Bill kind of touched on that earlier. So it's really looking at, how to contextualize the actual impact against our sustainability end goal. So what are we measuring against, what I ultimately want to maintain and achieve? And if we go back to the examples I gave earlier, and this means looking at our community's greenhouse gas emissions against, zero, and we have interim targets that we can also look at, and that sets us on that trajectory so that we can monitor our progress. And in terms of water infrastructures, we're looking at the number of days each year that the reservoir capacity is at or above 30%, which is where we want to be. And then ultimately is, throughout the year, every day of the year, we can achieve that level. So the last example will, oh, sorry, this is the wrong slide. I apologize for that. But what we're looking at is the proportion of the population that can actually spend less than 30% of the household income on housing costs against the threshold, which is 100% of our population should be able to do that. So that concludes my slides, and yeah, happy to dive into a bit more into any of these examples, and thank you for giving me the time. Our experience.
Thank you so much, Ting. Really appreciate, despite like running a little bit over time, it was super informative, and I really didn't want to cut you off. So really, really inspiring, particularly because we are talking about application of a model within local government, within a system. And what you shared today with us was inspiring for me from so many different perspectives. From the fact that you mentioned you've been leveraging the learning and experience of other cities, Amsterdam, of course, for example. And then it was interesting that you brought up this fact that some of the councillors were championing that within the city. And that's exactly what we need. We need some people to help us move away from champion-based approach to systems-based approach. And to make this happen, we really need champions at the local level, at the local leadership. And also, this sequence of the city plan and integrated action plan that opened up this opportunity for really looking into adopting donut model in the city of Nanaimo, but also this is from city plan to this integrated action plan, and to monitoring the strategy that you have been leading, setting tailored key indicators and models. And this is my sort of my view that regardless of how functional it is, setting this in place is quite a big achievement, because down the line it will improve and sort of will fit for that given context. So thanks so much, sharing, for this valuable insight and experience. I'm sure the wealth of information that you had, we could extend this session for hours to go through the details. But as I mentioned, it was interesting to hear how you have used the donut model as a framework or guiding principle for all aspects of planning. And I imagine that this creates a strong sense of alignment across the activities of different departments within the local government, and also across different initiatives. I think that this is a fantastic example of how local governments can benefit from global knowledge by departing from cookie cutter approaches and ensuring that they are adapted to the local context. I mentioned in my introduction to this session that feedback loops and identifying how to measure success are critical to transforming our approaches. And it seems that this is an aspect that you have spent a significant amount of time co-developing that. So congratulations on that. And thank you again for your presentation and for giving us inspirational ideas for how local governments can take proactive action in adopting systemic approaches. Transitioning from global north, from Canada, going to global south, now we move to our next speaker, Danga. Danga is the program coordinator for well-governed cities. I'm excited to get your insights on this topic. Transformative approaches need to be scaled and contextualized and applied in other contexts worldwide for them to be truly effective. It would be great if you could share with us what good governance means within the South African context and how this can lead to more sustainable and resilient cities for all. Thanks again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks to the co-panelists for the very interesting presentations. And I suppose I may just start off by going to your introduction, Poria, speaking to the Global South and the Global North, and perhaps speak a bit to how we got to this question around sustainability in the first place. And in many ways, it's because of the British Industrial Revolution, modernization theory, and the idea that actually all of us should be aspiring to the standard of living and the material aspirations and material achievements of what we would now consider to be the G8 group of countries. Clearly, other countries, including mine, Malawi, which is one of the poorest in the world, is basically, since independence, we've been about catching up. So what this has really, and these two things have kind of come to a head in the discussion around the climate change and sustainability. And for that reason, you'll see the viewpoint of large developed countries like developing, rather middle-income countries like China and India would say, well, why can't we use the same methods that you used, meaning the global north, to get to this place? And in South Africa, this provides a particularly interesting area of contestation around these ideas for two reasons. South Africa is probably the example of the most egregious example of empire, which, if you will, was Western countries imposing themselves on other parts of the world through the apartheid system, which was a very highly racialized system of governing the country. And then also because South Africa has a large carbon footprint, because it is a middle-income country with large coal reserves. And the question is, in South Africa, and the one that the local government in our country deals with, is how do we actually ensure just transitions in urban areas of South Africa, primarily because South Africa, being a middle-income country, is in fact very highly urbanized, and about 68% of the population lives in urban areas compared to sort of lower-income countries. And what that means for us is that, policy commitments to sustainable development don't necessarily lead to social and environmental justice. And I think from the South perspective, and indeed from South Africa's perspective, local government, and interestingly, looking at Randy's comments at the beginning, we're still very much in that what you consider to be the primary phase. So one of the primary acts of our constitution is still to ensure that basic service delivery is achieved for our citizens. And this is something that, in fact, local government, the most important metric that local government is still judged by and is still not necessarily achieving. So it's just interesting to contrast, I think, for the benefit of our audience, that different perspective that comes because of the particular context which South African cities are within. And not just in South Africa, but in keeping with all governance models around the world. I mean, governance is really about managing competing public and private interests around resources, allocation decisions, and so on within the society. And despite the fact of South Africa having a very progressive constitution, probably one of the most progressive in the world, and that we have positive rights enshrined in our constitution, not just negative rights, but there still are contestations between different sectors, between different stakeholders with different power and influence. And so governance from a progressive point of view really involves and requires that those managing those competing interests in a particular way to and so the way in which a city is governed, from a point of view of a just transition, is a complex and multifaceted issue. And in South Africa, urban governance is guided by a combination of formal plans. We have legislation, we have frameworks that direct urban planning, but also a range of other tacit factors such as political and financial pressures. And so local governments find themselves increasingly because municipalities in South Africa are defined as not just the administration within which the practitioners sit, but the entire municipal space, which includes residents, businesses within that jurisdiction, and indeed academies, think tanks, and so on. And so what we at the South African Cities Network, advocate for, and we represent primarily the 8 metropolitan municipalities. Our research is focused on those and the intermediate cities, is thinking about how we can enable our local governments to better address these challenges that manifest themselves in our urban spaces in South Africa. There are multiple sites of governance and contestation within our cities. And so what we advocate for is a co-production approach, and we call it a whole of government and an all of society approach. So the local sphere in South Africa, in fact, is highly capacitated. We don't just have decentralization, but we had devolution. So we talk about 3 co-equal spheres of government: national, provincial, and local, and not a hierarchy of government. And to add to that, we also have the concept and the view that the local sphere is where is the coalface of development, and where sustainable development will be achieved, and our populations will benefit from all the efforts that the government needs to make to transform what was an abnormal society into a normal one. And so, having said that, there's been, as you can expect, a massive investment in capacity building within the local sphere to address the significant challenges that South Africa faces. We're the most unequal country in the world as a result, as I said, of that apartheid system and the most egregious form of colonialism that's been seen in the world. And so that has meant real challenges in sort of addressing the backlog of service delivery, but also the government's capacity to deal with that. And a recent review has actually found that efforts to build capacity have focused on individuals within the system and not perhaps looked at the capability of the institution. And perhaps this speaks to more some of the systemic management issues that were mentioned at the beginning. And I think I found that a very interesting intervention for me to kind of get my head around. But also speaking to the need for contextualization for co-production, I mentioned already, but also a whole of municipality approach in order to achieve the goals that we would like to see. One of the things that we do believe in South Africa, and is very sort of set in our local government architecture, is that it's democratic, and that therefore there has been a strength or really an emphasis placed on ensuring citizen engagement between elections through what we call integrated development plans, which are the 5-year plan for the city, and require community engagement to sign off on the plans that the government is proposing for communities. And indeed, citizens and communities are encouraged to propose what they would like to see, the vision that they would like to see in their local spaces. And so hence, and perhaps just in closing, because I'm conscious of time, is what then does that role for collaboration between cities? I think as ICLEI, the ICLEI model is about collaboration, as is the South African Cities Network model. And we were essentially formed by the metropolitan municipalities in 2002 when they realized that the particular urban challenges they faced in South Africa required a think tank, if you will, that addressed particular challenges that they face. So we're organized around thematic areas that inform our theory of change. So we have a productive cities program, which looks at city economies, an inclusive cities program, which looks at inclusion, a well-governed cities program, which is the one that I head up, which looks at urban governance and municipal finance. And we also have a sustainable and resilient cities program, which looks at, not surprisingly, as you'd imagine, issues around climate change, sustainability, and resilience. And we primarily serve as a clearinghouse, if you will, a place to share information, to share experience across cities, and established peer-to-peer learning networks, which have been really instrumental in allowing practitioners to share best practice amongst themselves, pitfalls, advantages of various different approaches to governance within their particular context. So I'll just wrap it up there, Poria, and see if there's any questions, perhaps.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Danga. I appreciate your valuable and very thought-provoking input. You shared a really grounding perspective on different levels of development and what this means for sustainability, especially the challenge of, as you said, catching up with the G8 countries and doing so in a sustainable way by modern standards. This is such a crucial perspective that international targets do not align with what is needed for social and environmental justice in countries in this position. with many competing priorities, it's interesting to hear that co-production is the method that you have arrived at as the best way forward for metropolitan areas in South Africa. There are many overlaps between the approaches that you have outlined and the systemic management approach and the tools and concepts that the other fellow panelists shared. And I would be excited to continue and go into more depth in this conversation with all of you beyond this session. Knowing that we are almost coming to the end of this very exciting conversation and almost 90 minutes gone quite quickly, I would like to yield the floor to each and every one of our speakers for 45 seconds of a final concluding remark. But before doing so, I would like to ask them to sort of think what would be the key message that they would like to share. Or alternatively, you can share your reflections on potential questions. First and foremost, thank you so much for taking the questions in writing. I noticed that there were 8 questions, 7 of them were answered already, so thanks a lot for that. But we would start with Randy, going to Ting, and then Danga, and concluding the session with Bill. Randy might consider, responding to this and sharing some of his thoughts on the multi-capital scorecards and application of it in the city of Nanaimo, and what are the key learnings from this process. Or Ting, maybe you can respond to this question that as the city applied this approach of multi-capital scorecard, what benefits and challenges did you perceive within the process? Or if you could change one aspect of how you measure the progress, what would you change it? And Danga, also it would be helpful to hear from you. What do you think would be the scalability of a tool such as multi-capital scorecard? Do you think that it could be effective in South African context and for South Africa cities? And perhaps, Bill, it would be great to hear your thoughts on the topic of assessment. What do you think is the future of standards relating to sustainable governance practices? With that, I would like to yield the floor to Randy for his 45 seconds powerful concluding remarks. Thank you, Randy. Over.
Yeah, I'll do my best in reflecting on the experience of the city of Nanaimo and city of Kitchener. I think I want to point to the direction that we're heading and what this means. I think we've spoken confidently and perhaps with a lot of information that we believe in, but what I want to offer is this idea of a transition towards systemic strategic management practices is certainly by no means well understood and a prescriptive one. And so the burden, the challenge that rests upon us now, understanding this possibility and believing it is the path forward, is to learn through experience. And so we are developing a partnership, something called Municipalities Adapting in Response to Complexity, that Porya may or may not have time to speak to. It'll be included. There'll be information on that included in the links that'll be provided at the end of this. And what I want to offer is that, we are looking for municipalities, including leaders, academics, other innovators, those from the sector who are interested in learning with us. We'll only learn through applying innovations in practice and sort of figuring out how to make this kind of work effective in any context. And so we encourage you all to reach out and to join us in this process of learning and future development. Thank you so much.
Learning and future development. Thank you so much, Randy. Without any further ado, we'll move to Ting to share her concluding remark. Ting, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think the benefits is really, I think, to reflect on what is the purpose of our work. I think that in municipal government, we're always, busy responding to things, and this provides an opportunity for us to pause and talk to each other and to really figure out, what is the ultimate purpose of our services and how should we work together, and really, just that integration piece. The challenges, I think, was, because we haven't been asking those critical questions, and in some areas, the data and the information is not there, and it's really complex it takes a lot of energy and investment of time on top of your operational demand to figure these out. So you were asking what is the one thing that I wish that I could change in the process. I think, I wish that we budgeted more time and also resource to really investing in developing and having that kind of conversation internally.
Thank you so much. This is powerful. I don't want to, make it like cliche, but like my two important keywords from you was like data, such information and resources, and that's certainly a meaningful link to one of the questions that was posed to you earlier throughout the session. Thanks so much for that one. Moving to Danga, the floor is yours.
Thank you to my co-panelists. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount today, and I think it was really, in fact, as I was engaging, because I was kind of in some sense, switching gears when you would have heard my comments, thinking about governance in particular. But I think the ideas around sort of systemic innovation clearly and management innovation clearly would be the kind of the kind of ideas and changing, because if you want to look at the South Africa, I mean, that idea of the iceberg and changing the way the leaders think, I mean, I think that part of what's happened in South Africa is that there's been a fundamental shift in the narratives that people tell, which are at the very bottom of that iceberg, just about the society that we want and the society that we would desire, let alone adding issues of sustainability and questions around sustainability. And so the UNRIST, work, Bill, your work, incredibly interesting. The multi-capitalist scorecard, I'm sure would be one that we could apply here in South Africa. And I think one of the things I think in particularly middle income and developing country context is the lack of data and the need to have more and better data that allows us to tell stories and to assess how we are doing, in this case, in relation to sustainability targets and goals. So really just to say thank you for the opportunity and for the learning experience.
We really appreciate that you also contributed valuable insights into this conversation. Moving forward to our last speaker, Bill, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Poria. And on the question of sustainable governance, I think what we really need to do, what the evidence shows, is that we've got a governance system that you could call an overshoot and collapse governance system. That's what we've been in for the last half century, and arguably much longer than that. And I want to pick up on Danga's presentation by affirming that I think that this is largely, if not exclusively, due to the colonialist impacts. That when we look at indigenous cultures in particular, they've persisted for millennia. They are by definition sustainable. You can look at Lila June Johnston's latest dissertation for evidence of that, as compared to the average lifespan of a Western civilization is 336 years. So Western civilizations are by definition governed in an unsustainable way. So I think that we really need to step back and reassess the values that we're applying in our governance, and in particular, live within our means and ensure the means to live. That's what context-based sustainability is all about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill, for a very interesting conclusion. I think I myself learned a lot from this conversation, and it was very interesting for me to hear how these bits and pieces can come together for transformative change. Speaking, from the good governance perspective, the needs to data and information, looking into indigenous context, what Bill you just mentioned in terms of this whole Western modern societies being governed in a non-sustainable way, and the need for tools and approaches to really transform these governance systems in the first place, to be able to transform the whole community. And refraining from using these conservative and reformative approaches to transformative governance and planning systems, where we need the concepts such as enterprise evolution, which is a very concrete program as part of this broader systemic management innovation, and then exploring how we can translate the international agendas and models such as donut economy, in this case, that our colleague Ting showcased how they adopted within the context of a city. And then this misalignment between international agendas and frameworks, with the realities on the ground, particularly in Global South. And this is obviously a conversation that we are having within a broader group. We are developing a position paper with Randy and other esteemed colleague Manuel and a few other colleagues explaining how these bits and pieces can come together and how these approaches could be applied in different contexts globally to create a collective impact. And I think that is our prime objective out of this conversation. That is certainly an opportunity for me that we have to conclude this session. But as we come to the end of this truly inspiring session, I would like to express my gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us today. A special thanks to our esteemed speakers. Thanks so much for joining us. Randy, Bill, wonderful contribution, and Danga, really meaningful and valuable insight from Global South context. We have explored a wide range of topics and insights into how local government and organization can effectively navigate the complexity of current opportunities and challenges. This has been an exceptional opportunity for learning, and I would like to thank you all for participating actively in this session and helping to make it as impactful as possible. Your active participation has made this session a valuable and insightful experience. So let's keep the conversation going, share our successes, and collaborate to ensure that we continue this ongoing journey. A big thanks also to our fabulous Daring Cities team for their wonderful background work in making this forum happen. In case that you are interested in digging deeper into the content and activities that have been shared today by our speakers, we'll share a link to a Google Doc in the chat, which has links from each of the speakers today for you to leave the session with and pursue further. This is in response to a question that was posed to the panelists in terms of asking for the links. So before concluding, I would like to bring to your attention the next Daring City session scheduled for 12th of September. We will also be hosting this session in collaboration with our partner Mission Innovation. We will be unpacking the expanded climate and innovation agenda, which is very much linked to the conversation that we had today. We'll be basically unpacking the agenda and also what it means for cities and regions, trying to ensure that citizens can lead flourishing lives, and taking a systemic and innovative approach to address the climate emergency at a systemic level. I highly recommend joining us for that session as well. So if you haven't yet registered, we are sharing the link in the chat right now. Stay curious, stay innovative, and stay inspired. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you soon. Have a great one.